America has been waging a war against blacks since the 1600s. The Luciferian elites ruling the nation has also deceived white Americans into serving their diabolical purposes by creating an illusion of white supremacy. America is now at the point of no return, facing the wrath of the Most High for the crimes committed against his people. In the second part of the series, we will continue to expose the hidden hand of the elite and how they are still working behind the scenes to bring about the wars they want. Also, in the last session, I told you about Pompeii and how its destruction tied into the destruction of Jerusalem. Well, a viewer sent me some information that I'm going to share in this session that's even more mind-blowing than that. I will say this, even in the times of Yah's chastening, he has been merciful unto us. So let's get into this. As I pointed out in the last session, the elite created white supremacy as a strategy to divide and conquer. They did it by creating a new class of people classified as white and provided them with economic incentives to get them to police and dominate our people. The top 1% own 40% of the wealth in this country. Blacks own less than 5% of the wealth, and the amount is so small it's not even showing in this chart. But for some, even that minuscule amount is too much. So let's delve deeper so that we understand how the elite has been orchestrating race riots, lynchings, and other devious tactics to maintain this wealth inequality in America. Take a look at this map. The orange dots represent racial violence that resulted in property or economic loss across America against African Americans or blacks. So it says these acts of racial violence took aim at the roots of generational wealth, shaping the nation and its inequities in ways we still see today. So this practice or these practices serve the purposes of the elite. Let's dig deeper into this article. Let's read this account from a reporter named Carlos Hurd. He describes the scene as a white mob stoned and murdered black people on the streets of East St. Louis in 1917. He says, I saw Negro women begging for mercy and pleading that they had harmed no one, set upon by white women of the baser sort who laughed and answered the coarse sallies of men as they beat the negress's face and breasts with fists, stones, and sticks. Now, look, it goes on to say the mob killed nearly 50 people, mostly black, and drove 6,000 from the city. If you force 6,000 black families out of their homes, what do you think happened to their property? Just think about that. Everything they had worked for, gone. It says the mob had formed because of an earlier incident that began with a white man in a Ford who'd been shooting into black homes. Black residents had armed themselves and fired on two men approaching in a car, killing them. Those men later turned out to be police officers. So then you have to wonder, was this staged? Let's keep going. Here is an incident that happened in 1863 in Detroit, Michigan. It says on March 6, 1863, a tavern owner named William Faulkner was found guilty of sexually assaulting a white girl. Outside the courthouse, a mostly white crowd clashed with officials as they tried to get at Faulkner. When they couldn't, they roamed Detroit streets, attacking African Americans and setting buildings on fire, which left nearly 200 black residents homeless. Local papers had called Faulkner a Negro, though Faulkner said he was Spanish Indian. Faulkner's accusers later recanted, and he was released from prison, as noted in research by the late Matthew Kundinger when he was a University of Michigan history student. So this was the go-to weapon right here, you all. They use white mobs to incite violence. All they had to say was a white woman was attacked. But the damage was done here. Over 200 residents lost their homes. Were they compensated for that? Of course not. So here's a quote from Trina Shanks, a non-resident fellow at the Urban Institute. She said, if blacks were successful and actually were visibly prosperous, that made them a target. Some of the violence might have been triggered by this economic envy. So then the article goes on to say that during the 1870s and 1880s, some black businessmen and entrepreneurs amassed wealth rivaling that of many whites. So apparently this was the motivating factor for attacks. Basically, they were saying, you have one crumb too many. So mobs would be stirred up to come and attack these people because they were gaining wealth. Let's keep going. All right, so it says this result of where white people get to benefit in the aftermath of violence. It says it repeats itself well into the 20th century. So it lists places like this place in Florida where a successful black labor broker attempted to vote. And this sparked a massacre. This massacre was so violent that black residents left their properties, and within a month, their land was advertised for sale at special bargain. By whom? Confederate veterans. It says the racial violence during and after Reconstruction in the South began as whites sought to maintain their supremacy economically, politically, and socially. You all, do you really think what's happening in the inner cities is a coincidence? Now, this sums up what has been happening to our people beautifully. Listen to this. Though these massacres happened many decades ago, their economic impact was widespread and long-lasting, and it can still be felt today. The wealth disparity between white and black Americans is stunning. The typical non-Hispanic white family had a net worth of over $188,000 in 2019, while the typical non-Hispanic black family's wealth was about $24,000. So it says this enormous gap stems in part from the historic destruction of black towns, homes, and businesses, which hampered black Americans' ability to amass financial assets, particularly housing, and to pass them down to their children and grandchildren to help build wealth. This says, while the perception of race riots is often of black rioting, the worst and most frequent race riots were whites against blacks. The worst such riot in U.S. history was the New York draft riot, which killed 119 blacks and scarred the city of New York forever. These are the things we won't hear about in the history books. So listen to this. This article is Violence Against Blacks in America. And it says, according to the Equal Justice Initiative, lynchings were a method of social and racial control intended to terrorize black Americans into submission and into an inferior racial case or caste position that was widely practiced in the U.S. from 1877 through the 1950s, because lynchings were typically executions outside the scope of official court proceedings and without any formal tracking system. Did you catch that? Most historians and scholars have little doubt that the true number of lynchings in this country have been dramatically underreported. Nonetheless, most of the more than 4,400 documented victims of racial terror lynching who were killed between 1877 and 1950 were killed in the 12 southern states, with Mississippi, Georgia, and Louisiana among the deadliest. Several hundred additional victims were lynched in other regions, with the highest numbers in Oklahoma, Missouri, Illinois, and West Virginia. However, it is significant to note that there are countless other victims who were undocumented and remain unknown. Now, listen to this part, because this is why I say this was sanctioned terrorism. The politicians knew this. They were in on it. It says there was little pretense to hide the act of lynching African Americans. They were often committed in broad daylight and sometimes on the courthouse lawn. These types of racial terror lynchings were directly linked to the re-establishment of white supremacy and America's history of the enslavement of blacks. Racial terror lynchings were different from the hangings and the mob violence committed against white people, because racially motivated lynchings were intended to terrorize the entire black community, serving as a way to enforce racial hierarchy. I'll drop down. It says typically a lynching would begin with a criminal accusation being leveled against a black, most often a black man, a subsequent arrest, and the formation of a lynch mob, intent of subverting the normal judicial process, or expressed more directly, their intent was to take the law into their own hands. Despite its lawlessness and terrifying unpredictability, lynchings nonetheless had the unmistakable sanction of law enforcement and elected officials. As such, perpetrators were emboldened to act with impunity. Perhaps most disturbing was the fact that once rumors of a lynching began to circulate, lynch mobs frequently were given the green light by law enforcement, who would facilitate the wishes of the lynch mob by conveniently leaving a black inmate's jail cell unguarded and unlocked. You all, they didn't need the accusation to be true. They just needed an insinuation. No proof was needed. Why? They knew that law enforcement had their back. We just witnessed that in the Ahmaud Arbery trial. That case would have been a wrap if it wasn't for the persistence of his family and others. The good old boys system had already swept it under the rug. They killed that young man and found enough time to take a picture of him because the sister posted it on her social media page. Who does that? Who does that? Let's keep going.
A historical marker on the courthouse square in Cumming will soon remind people of the 1912 lynching of a black man.
It was the beginning of a racial cleansing that resulted in the expulsion of more than 1,000 black residents from Forsyth County. Brendan Keefe shows you how the richest county in Georgia is now facing its racist past.
It is hidden in a narrow patch of forest between rows of $500,000 homes. Even looking straight down, nothing betrays the mystery of what lies beneath. These tombstones are all that's left of the old Black Baptist Church at Stony Point. Look closely at the dates. Why do they all end before 1912? This is not evidence of promises broken, but of loved ones kept away, because the men, women, and children buried here were the only black residents of Forsyth County, Georgia, for nearly all of the 20th century.
All of the Negro people had to leave. There was knocking on the door, and they were told to get out.
Elon Osby heard the story directly from her own mother, Willie Mae Bagley, just a 2-year-old back in 1912 when the Night Riders came to their home and so many others in Forsyth County.
Can you imagine the fear that they would have felt?
William and Ida Bagley paid taxes on 60 acres they owned in 1912. We could find no record of any sale in the county courthouse except those of white men later selling parcels of the Bagleys' land to one another. The 1910 census showed the Bagleys among 1,098 black residents of the county, a tenth of the total population. By 1920, nearly every last one of them was gone.
There are these long stretches where decade after decade, the black population of Forsyth County is zero.
Historical photos show only white faces after 1912. So what happened that year? Thousands turned out to celebrate the public hanging of 2 black teenagers convicted in a single day by an all-white jury of raping and murdering a white girl named Mae Crow. The other black suspect had already been lynched right here on the Cumming Courthouse Square.
The lynching of Rob Edwards involved a very large crowd gathering outside the jail, dragging him out of the jail, beating him with crowbars, dragging his body around town behind a wagon, and then eventually his corpse is hoisted to on a telegraph pole, and everyone in the crowd takes turns shooting into his body.
Just across from the spot where Rob Edwards was lynched, Lady Justice faces history wearing her blindfold. But soil from the square has been collected in a jar, and the name Rob Edwards will soon join the lynching memorial at the Equal Justice Initiative.
The Community Remembrance Project of Forsyth County really got this rolling and worked with the Equal Justice Initiative. So they're going to put up a marker that will memorialize Rob Edwards and tell the story of that lynching. And that's going to be on the spot where he was lynched, which is something that I never thought I would live to see.
This with the marker is a first step.
There are already several hidden markers to the black community that once thrived here, now surrounded by new neighborhoods that are increasingly diverse. Some of those new residents are buying homes here, on the land Elon's grandparents once owned. The old Bagley place is now among the most valuable real estate in Metro Atlanta.
So not only do they incite racial violence, the groups who will benefit from it the most, from the uprisings, infiltrate it. They pretend to be one of the protesters. We witnessed this during the George Floyd protests. This article is from The Conversation, and it asks, why are white supremacists protesting the deaths of black people? Indeed, why are they? So why do they do it? Well, it says the idea that inducing chaos, provoking law enforcement, and promoting political tension will hasten the collapse of Western government. This is what they're after. All right, it says joining the crowds provides these groups an opportunity to discredit protesters by inciting, looting, rioting, violence, and vandalism, which they hope will spark like-minded white Americans to resist the civil disobedience of protesters. So the puppet masters stoke the racial flames, and the whites who believe minorities are taking their country feel they need to take their country back. But what's evidently clear is that the majority of their violent acts are against blacks. What they don't realize is that this is a war that the puppet masters want. The elite play both sides, and they fund both sides. By creating chaos, they will be able to step in and dominate both groups because it will help them to usher in their one world government. Folks, it should be clear that the children of Esau are the masterminds working behind the scenes. So let's see how the politicians play into this. So this comes from PJ Media, and it's called Democrats Feed Racism to Control Our Black Community. So take a look at this picture. Take a good look. See who's in it. What would compel her to wrap herself in African garb and take a knee? Well, it was during the election, and they needed the vote. Did it work? Of course it did. They bring out the same playbook every 4 years. The Republicans are no better. But it's during this time that the Democrats seem to really take notice of racial injustice and crimes against our people. Do you remember how many of the candidates came out talking about reparations? How many of them are talking about it now? This is their tactic to secure the black vote, and it works every time. They begin talking about the plight of the poor and how Democrats are fighting for the poor. Please. Once they're voted in, other things take priority. Our people are being played. On the other hand, the Republicans stir up their base by promoting patriotism and talking about the border. It's amazing how masses of immigrants just seem to appear, trying to cross over the borders during an election, or how crime rates, mostly committed by blacks, just seem to skyrocket. They begin using religious languages and images to make Republicans believe that their candidate was sent by God to help them get their country back. Sadly, they don't realize they never owned this country. It was corrupt from its inception, owned by the Luciferian elite. So both groups use race baiting. This article from CNN Business says blacks will take hundreds of years to catch up to white wealth. The wealth gap between blacks and whites in America will take hundreds of years to close, if ever. It's saying it will take 228 years for black families to accumulate the same amount of wealth as whites. So do you see? This system is rigged. We cannot, as a people, prosper in this system the way that it's set up. 228 years for black families to accumulate the same amount of wealth, but for Latino families, it will take 84 years. So it should be clear to us that something is amiss. You all, this is a fulfillment of prophecy, and it proves that we are the people of the book. Let me show you. So, how did we end up here? Disobedience. Let's read Deuteronomy 28:38-46. This is from the Septuagint. Moses is telling the people what would happen to them if they failed to keep the commandments. And you will see that these verses pertain to prosperity or the lack thereof because of disobedience. And just know that this is referring to our people as a whole. It says, "Thou shalt carry forth much seed into the field, and thou shalt bring in little, because the locust shall devour it. Thou shalt plant a vineyard and dress it, and shalt not drink the wine, neither shalt thou delight thyself with it, because the worm shall devour it. Thou shalt have olive trees in all thy borders, and thou shalt not anoint thee with oil, because thine olive shall utterly cast its fruit. Thou shalt beget sons and daughters, and they shall not be thine, for they shall depart into captivity. All thy trees and the fruits of thy land shall the blight consume. The stranger that is within thee shall get up very high, and thou shalt come down very low. He shall lend to thee, and thou shalt not lend to him. He shall be the head, and thou shalt be the tail. And all these curses shall come upon thee, and shall pursue thee, and shall overtake thee, until he shall have consumed thee, and until he shall have destroyed thee, because thou didst not hearken to the voice of the Lord thy God, to keep his commands and his ordinances, which he has commanded thee. And these things shall be signs in thee, and wonders among thy seed forever. These things are signs to let us know we are the people. But there is hope. Let's keep going. Now let's look at Deuteronomy 30, 1 through 10, the promise of restoration. And it shall come to pass, when all these things shall have come upon thee, the blessing and the curse, which I have set before thy face, and thou shalt call them to mind. Where will they call them to mind? Among all the nations wherein the Lord shall have scattered thee. And shall return to the Lord thy God, and shall hearken to his voice, according to all things which I charge thee this day, with all thy heart and with all thy soul. Then the Lord shall heal thine iniquities, and shall pity thee, and shall again gather thee out from the nations among which the Lord has scattered thee. If thy dispersion be from one end of heaven to the other, thence will the Lord thy God gather thee, and thence will the Lord thy God take thee, and the Lord thy God shall bring thee in from thence into the land which thy fathers have inherited, and thou shalt inherit it, and he will do thee good, and multiply thee above thy fathers. But listen, there's more. And the Lord shall purge thy heart and the heart of thy seed, to love the Lord thy God with all thy heart and with all thy soul, that thou mayest live. And the Lord thy God will put, listen, these curses upon thine enemies, and upon those that hate thee, who have persecuted thee, and thou shalt return and hearken to the voice of the Lord thy God, and shall keep his commands, all that I charge thee this day. And the Lord thy God shall bless thee in every work of thine hands, in the offspring of thy body, and in the offspring of thy cattle, and in the fruits of thy land, because the Lord thy God will again rejoice over thee for good, as he rejoiced over thy fathers, if thou wilt hearken to the voice of the Lord thy God, to keep his commandments and his ordinances and his judgments written in the book of this law. If thou turn to the Lord thy God with all thine heart and with all thy soul. So Israel, just know that this system has not worked for us, because our condition was to serve as a sign that we broke covenant. It also served as a sign to help us identify ourselves. But think about this. These nations were allowed to prosper in their wickedness. That's how you know that this is the beast system and it's of Lucifer. The Most High is not going to allow you to prosper in wickedness. But you can still see, in spite of it all, he has made a way of escape for us. So before I close this out, I want to tell you about some information shared with me from one of our listeners after hearing me talk about the destruction of Pompeii last week and its connection to the destruction in 70 AD, Arad Yasharala sent this to me, so thank you very much, and I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. And it was a video about the Lisbon earthquake in 1755. I had not heard of it. So I really encourage you to watch it. I wasn't able to show the video, but this is a snapshot of it. And if you do a search and type in Portugal earthquake in 1755 YouTube, you should be able to find it. To me, it seemed like even though we were being punished, the Most High still had mercy on us. And it was definitely a clear message to our oppressors, just like with Pompeii. So I'll share some of that with you. Let's take a look at some of this. So listen to this account of what happened. This article entitled The Lisbon Earthquake of 1755, the day the world was shaken. Now it says the earthquake struck on All Saints' Day, which is a Catholic holy feast day. But if you search the roots of it, it's pagan. But it says that brought hundreds of worshipers to Lisbon's churches and cathedrals. It is estimated that much of the city's population, around 200,000, was gathered for Mass. This was at the same time that the earthquake hit. So it says, on this day, church-goers lit candles in the city's many churches, and when the earthquake struck, tearing down the buildings and structures that weren't designed to withstand the tremors, the lit candles started fires that further compounded the destruction of the city. The fires destroyed the city for days after the last of the tremors were felt, and took even more lives. So it goes on to talk about the aftermath of the earthquake and how those who didn't die, when the buildings began crumbling, they started running to the river's edge to try to escape the fire and all of the havoc going on in the city. But then it says suddenly a massive tsunami hit. So it says during the following 3 hours after the earthquake, an additional 2 tsunamis hit Lisbon. Thousands of city residents who had survived the initial quake were drowned by the tsunami or killed in the rush of debris that the water carried with it. Those who survived both the earthquake and tsunamis were forced to combat ravaging fires spreading through the higher ground areas of the city untouched by the water. It says, as the religious celebrations called for flowers and decorations, in addition to the candles, the fire spread easily through the materials. The fires weren't put out until 5 days after the earthquake. Listen to this. It is saying that the Lisbon that existed before the earthquake almost entirely disappeared. It says the earthquake leveled about 85% of the city's infrastructure. Wow, and there's more. So listen to these interesting facts about the quake. It says the famous author Voltaire, who witnessed the quake, referenced the event in his book Candide. In it, he parodies the widespread thinking at the time that the earthquake was caused by God's wrath. What else it says? It says Lisbon was not the only area affected by the quake. It also talks about it hitting all the coastal towns and villages that were destroyed. They were also destroyed in that region. It says shocks from the quake were felt as far north as Finland, with tsunamis also sweeping the southern coast of Africa. Nearly 70%, listen to this, of Lisbon's dwellings, about 23,000 buildings, were destroyed or substantially damaged by the combined effects of shaking, fire, and tsunami. But don't miss this. About 32% to 48% of Portugal's GDP at the time was lost due to the effects of the destruction. So all that money they had made as a result of trafficking our people around the world, all the gold and diamonds they stole, they lost almost half of their wealth. You all, is this a coincidence? You tell me. So I'll highlight a few things from this NPR article, and it's an interview. Robert Siegel is talking to Mark Molesky, associate professor at Seton Hall, and he examined the Lisbon, Portugal earthquake. So listen to some of the things he said. All right, so he says, Molesky speaking, tens of thousands of people have died. The fascinating thing about the Lisbon earthquake is that as a megathrust earthquake in the Atlantic Ocean, it caused a very rare Atlantic Ocean tsunami. So we know that what happened was very rare. Let's go on. Molesky makes this statement in the last paragraph. The scientists can't explain this phenomenon, and perhaps we have to fall back on the old cause of earthquakes, which is God, which is the Almighty who is sending us a message in this particular instance. You think? All right, he goes on to say, Lisbon today rarely makes the front pages of the newspapers in the West. But in 1755, it was one of the richest cities in the world. It was the major New World port, and it was essentially dripping with gold and diamonds that had been discovered, I use that word lightly, in previous decades in Brazil. And so many people saw it as, you know, God's attempt to sort of punish this rich, hubristic capital. He says, but also it was one of the last centers of the Inquisition. People were still being burnt at the stake in 1755 in Lisbon. Listen, the house of the Inquisition actually collapsed during the earthquake, and many people, particularly Protestants, saw this as the work of God. So what should we know about Lisbon? It says Lisbon in Portugal was the major port involved in the Portuguese slave trade. Ships went to West Africa and took enslaved Africans across the Atlantic to the Portuguese-owned colony of Brazil. Many of the slaves were carried to plantations and mines in Brazil. Also, drop down, it says, the Portuguese city of Porto made a strong brandy, especially for the Africa trade. 3 anchors, which was a measured unit of it, would buy a young male slave. Was this a coincidence, you all? You tell me. Israel, even though he was chastening us, the Most High was still fighting for his people. He would not let them utterly destroy us. We need to be praying, repenting, rededicating our hearts, our minds, our souls to the Most High, and calling for judgment. I hope this message has been a blessing to you. Join me next time. Shalom, everyone.